Second hour of the Elias Makos Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will be with you straight through until noon. Now, we begin this second hour of the program by taking a look at why the U.S. has lost trust in Canada, particularly when it comes to the border and the fight against fentanyl. It's our pleasure to welcome Sam Cooper onto the program. He's founder and first journalist over at The Bureau. Sam, welcome back to the program.
Great to be back.
And I know, we began talking on this program in the lead up to the foreign interference inquiry and all of the news that was coming out in this country when it comes to foreign interference. And lo and behold, I think there are some links here when it comes to the war on fentanyl and foreign interference, in fact. I was reading your piece in the Bureau this week. Why don't you tell our listeners here about your reporting this week about how U.S. officials have lost faith in Canadian law enforcement?
Yes, Elias, this is something I've been hearing for years with my focus on talking to off-the-record intelligence and enforcement sources in North America. And since covering British Columbia's casino money laundering scandals, which all related to Chinese transnational drug trafficking, I had been hearing for years that the RCMP was very ill-equipped to prosecute international organized crime. In most cases, it was the U.S. authorities with their powerful intelligence capacities that were coming to Canada and saying that you have these Chinese transnational triads set up in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. They're working with Mexican cartels and Iranian state-sponsored crime. Those are the highest level international criminal threats. They threaten to undermine governments in the world. And so Canada would be given this information. There were some, efforts to prosecute that fell apart in federal court. It's mostly related to Canada's legal requirements to turn over so much information to criminal defense lawyers. And as it turns out, the Americans, they're forced into a position where they would have to disclose their very deep intelligence sources in Canadian courts. So that's a legal problem. But beyond that, a number of people came forward to me in the recent weeks because they believed it was time. Canadians know and are not politically hoodwinked by certain leaders that maybe don't want the public to understand. As bad, really, as brazen as Mr. President Trump's threats are to Canada over tariffs, the concern that Canada has a corruption problem in our enforcement and our border security, and that Canada is incapable, essentially, of prosecuting these transnational fentanyl networks that have come to Canada to use our weak laws, that's a real concern. And it's not just from President Trump, it's across the U.S. government. So there were many examples I was given, but essentially the most serious ones are a number of Canadian and U.S. officers believe there are high-level officials in Canada that are impeding investigations into Chinese organized crime that's set up in our cities.
Why impede? What do you think is going on there, particularly with the money laundering stuff, right? And of course, the money laundering is connected to drugs, but why is that happening? Do we have any indication as to why those hurdles, those roadblocks are being put up by Canadian authorities?
Well, the first one is the case that is known. That's Cameron Ordis, a very famous, notorious case by now. Canada's former top police intelligence official convicted for leaking Five Eyes signals intelligence of the highest sensitivity and classification to Iranian state-sponsored criminals using, as I reported, this is a court case in Ottawa, using Canadian banks at scale to launder billions of dollars, using Canadian cities to set up, encryption technology companies that were used by Mexican cartels. Mr. Ordis, there's a lot that hasn't been disclosed in his case. He also faced charges of preparing to leak Chinese espionage secrets, again, high-level intelligence. And so the story there is it appears to be a corruption story, but my sources in America and Canada believe it goes further than that people like Ordis, they don't believe he's the only one. They believe there's corruption in the Canadian government where people have been, for some reason, wanting to misdirect investigations into China, into Iran, and into high-level organized crime.
We're with Sam Cooper. His latest piece in the Bureau is entitled How the RCMP, CBSA, and the Trudeau government lost U.S. trust in the fentanyl fight. Sam, you make some explosive allegations here in this piece that you just released, particularly when it comes to the Prime Minister and former cabinet ministers being seen in proximity by U.S. officials to Asian organized crime suspects. Tell us a little bit more about what you're comfortable talking about when it comes to those serious allegations.
Yes. In my book, Willful Blindness, I had detailed that there are a number of photographs available in open source records, and these I can find in the many Mandarin language media entities in Canada that publish photos of the Prime Minister and senior Canadian officials meeting with so-called community leaders in many cases. And I detailed that some of these leaders photographically can be linked to what I knew to be RCMP casino money laundering or more general corporate money laundering investigations. So that's irrefutable. And I have asked the Prime Minister and his staff to respond, in a certain case that I linked to a major British Columbia, the largest casino money laundering case ever in Canada, a high-level target in that investigation, sitting right beside Justin Trudeau at a so-called cash for access fundraiser. And the Liberal Party responded that they have strict, as they call it, campaign donation rules. Mm-hmm. Never have they ever answered me, well, why then, is a purported organized crime suspect with alleged links to China sitting beside the Prime Minister? So I don't have the answer. But what goes further in this piece is I cited two Canadian police officials that said undercover RCMP surveillance also had concerns that the Prime Minister was at some of these fundraisers in Canada where known alleged Asian organized crime suspects had access to the Prime Minister at that meetings. And as one source in my story said, this is deeply concerning. It was talked about openly in some Canadian policing units, and the concerns would be, would people with ultra riches and alleged connections to China's government seek in any way to influence the Prime Minister? I was also, pointed towards a former cabinet minister who I'm not comfortable naming, at this point, but I can assure all your listeners that when multiple police sources say that this is a real concern, and my open source photographs point to the same concerns, it's a concern.
Sam, we just had the Foreign Interference Inquiry release its report. Just want to know, did we get any answers on that type of interference involvement out of that inquiry in its final report?
The short answer is I and other experts found that contrary to the evidence of the NSI COP report in 2024 and thousands of documents, it appeared that Commissioner Ogue seemed to downplay the threat. She said that certainly she's confident saying that foreign governments at scale are trying to interfere, and yet she said she found no evidence of Canadian politicians doing anything too bad in terms of, knowingly being caught up in those operations. So that is that. But I can tell you, very interestingly, in that report, although it didn't really come out in the final report, RCMP senior officers were asked, could they explain why in one case they decided not to pursue a money laundering investigation that, according to the commission evidence, was believed to be linked to Chinese state operations. And the answer was, well, there are so many money laundering operations that they didn't feel it would be very fruitful to pursue that. And frankly, Elias, I just find that stunning, but also somewhat supportive of what my report says. I think there's a lot of questions there. The last point is, look, President Trump's reasons for targeting Canada pointed specifically to British Columbia and their vulnerability to fentanyl. And it came out in the Hogue Commission that Premier David Eby, for some reason, reached out to Justin Trudeau's former national security advisor and said that Mr. Eby had major concerns with Vancouver's port and BC's vulnerability to fentanyl trafficking, and he was looking for some sort of support from the federal government. And all I can say is that, again, seems to be supportive of what President Trump is saying.
Sam, I'm running up against the clock, but I do want to ask you just on your last point and Donald Trump, because there's been a lot of talk that when it comes to tariffs and Donald Trump saying this has to do with fentanyl, that actually that's subterfuge. It has nothing to do with fentanyl. I just want to know your take. The hard stance we've seen from the U.S. on a whole bunch of fronts, how much of it actually has to do with our lax enforcement of fentanyl and money laundering?
Well, there's 2 to 3 points. One, I believe a lot of the geopolitical and strategic movements President Trump is making all around the world, including Panama, Greenland, Canada, and Mexico, do point to the growing threat of a war with China. So these are real concerns of the U.S. military being reflected in some very disruptive sort of policies from President Trump. But I do believe it's all about China. Secondly, there's no question. Anyone that looks into the evidence will not be able to refute that Canada, especially British Columbia, and also Toronto and Vancouver, in terms of large-scale money laundering operations, Canada has a deep vulnerability to the very issues that President Trump is pointing to. Lastly, is he using the fentanyl issue, to gain leverage over other things that he's attempting to, bring back factories to the United States? That could be true. I don't know the answer. Obviously, this man is a very powerful negotiator, but what I can say, Canadians can have absolute trust that if the U.S. government is concerned about Canada's role in fentanyl, that's not a lie. We are a fentanyl exporting nation, and we are not policing it well. So we're not just a threat to the U.S. in this way. Other allies in the world have similar concerns, although they're not powerfully targeting us the way that President Trump is.
Sam, I have to leave it there. I'm going to direct all of our listeners to read your reporting at thebureau.news. That's the website, thebureau.news. Sam, thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's Sam Cooper, founder of The Bureau.